In 1492, when Columbus stepped onto a beach in the Bahamas, he believed he had found nothing. Empty land. Wild forests. This is not the story of a new world. This is the story of a world that was already old. Our story doesn't start in 1492. It starts at least 15,000 years earlier, and maybe much longer ago than that. During the last ice age, sea levels dropped so low that a strip of land, scientists call it Beringia, connected Siberia to Alaska. For generations, small bands of hunter-gatherers crossed it, chasing mammoths, bison, and caribou into a continent no human had ever seen. For decades this, Clovis first, theory was the accepted story, that the earliest Americans arrived around 13,000 years ago. But the evidence has been rewriting itself. Fossilized footprints found at White Sands, New Mexico, suggest people were walking those salt flats over 20,000 years ago. Sites in Chile, Texas, and even Pennsylvania hint at human presence even earlier. The truth is, we don't have a clean starting date. What we have is proof that humans adapted to nearly every environment on the continent: tundra, desert, rainforest, mountain, and they did it with extraordinary speed. By 11,000 years ago, descendants of these first migrants had reached the southern tip of South America. 12,000 miles of new land, settled in a geological blink. Long before anyone built a pyramid in Egypt's Old Kingdom, something extraordinary was happening in what is now Louisiana. Around 3500 BC, hunter-gatherers at a site called Watson Brake built 11 earthen mounds arranged in a circle, without farming, without metal tools, without the wheel. This wasn't supposed to be possible according to old theories of how civilizations form. Complex societies were supposed to need agriculture first. Watson Brake broke that rule by thousands of years. Later, around 1700 BC, an even larger complex rose nearby, Poverty Point. Its earthworks required moving an estimated 750,000 cubic meters of soil, basket by basket, without a single draft animal. And these people weren't isolated. Artifacts found at Poverty Point came from 1,000 miles away: copper from the Great Lakes, stone from the Ozarks. A trade network was already alive in North America 4,000 years ago. This was just the beginning. If you'd stood on the Mississippi River near modern-day St. Louis in the year 1100 CE, you would not have found wilderness. You would have found one of the largest cities on Earth. Cahokia. At its height, it was home to an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people, larger than London at the time. At 14 nodes we're sitting at 61%. We need all 20 online to hit the 80% threshold. Below that, the pulse doesn't propagate far enough to reach orbital altitude. Asha, even if we hit 80%, we've never tested this at planetary scale. We don't actually know it works. Reyes looked at her steadily. We know the theory is sound. We know the alien signal data confirms the harmonic frequencies. What we don't know is whether we have the courage to try. Get me all 20 nodes online. That's the only variable I want to discuss. Project Holdfast had begun as an energy transmission concept. The idea was elegant in its simplicity: a network of gravitational resonance nodes spread across the planet, capable of transmitting clean energy between continents without a single cable. No satellites. No power lines. Just resonance. But 5 years into development, a junior engineer named Yuki Tanaka had noticed something in the math. Something no one had put in the proposal. At full planetary scale, above 80% coherence, the resonance field would generate a subquantum electromagnetic pulse. One that propagated outward from the planet's surface, past the atmosphere, all the way to orbital altitude. And that pulse would cause cascading system failure in any technology operating on the same base harmonic frequencies. The same frequencies the Vorkai had been broadcasting for decades. The same frequencies the listening post had spent 19 years documenting. In other words, Tanaka had discovered that Project Holdfast, their clean energy grid, could be used as a weapon, not a conventional one. It would not destroy a single ship. It would not fire a single shot. It would simply turn everything off. Race. Even if this works, we disable their fleet. Then what? They have backup systems. Emergency power. They'll be back online within hours. 6 hours, based on their own maintenance transmission logs. So we get 6 hours. And then they fire on us anyway, but now they're angry. No. We get 6 hours in which they are completely vulnerable, and we are not. 6 hours in which the conversation changes. 6 hours in which we stop being grade 4 and start being something they've never encountered before. We're not trying to win a war, Admiral. We're trying to win the right to be taken seriously. Admiral Juan stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Get me those 6 hours. By the early 1400s, a new power had risen in the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec, or more accurately, the Mexica. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways and crisscrossed by canals, a city of an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 people, larger than Paris or London at the time. It had floating gardens called chinampas that fed the entire metropolis, fresh water piped in by aqueduct, and a marketplace that Spanish conquistadors later described as more impressive than anything in Europe. And in South America, the Inca had built the largest empire on earth at that moment, larger than the Byzantine Empire, larger than the Mongol Khanates of the time. Stretching over 4,000 kilometers along the Andes, the Inca road system included suspension bridges woven from grass fiber, way stations every few miles, and a relay runner messaging system that could move information across the empire in days. They achieved this without a written language, instead using knotted cords called quipu to record numbers, taxes, and census data. Their stonework remains so precise that many of their walls have survived 500 years of earthquakes that destroyed Spanish colonial buildings built right beside them. None of these empires were primitive. They were rivals, in scale and sophistication, to anything happening in Europe or Asia at the same moment in history. But empires and megacities are only part of the story. North of Mexico, hundreds of distinct nations had developed their own systems of law, governance, and diplomacy. Around the 1100s to 1400s, 5 nations in what's now upstate New York, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, ended generations of warfare by forming the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes called the Iroquois Confederacy. It operated under a constitution, the Great Law of Peace, with checks on power, a council system, and clan mothers who held the authority to select and remove leaders. Centuries later, Benjamin Franklin and other founders studied this system directly while debating how the American colonies might unite, a historical fact many textbooks leave out entirely. Across the continent, the diversity was staggering. Over 500 distinct nations by the time of European contact, speaking hundreds of mutually unintelligible languages. Pacific Northwest nations built massive cedar plank houses and held elaborate potlatch ceremonies. Plains nations developed sophisticated bison hunting economies. Southeastern nations like the Muskogee and Cherokee maintained their own mound-building traditions and matrilineal political systems. This was not one Native America. It was a patchwork of independent nations as different from each other as France was from Persia. So why don't most people know any of this? When European contact came, it brought something far more devastating than any army, disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses native populations had no immunity to. Historians estimate that within a century of contact, somewhere between 80 and 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas died, largely from epidemic disease that often outran the explorers themselves, spreading from community to community ahead of any European ever arriving in person. Entire cities and nations collapsed before most Europeans ever saw them. The wilderness that later colonists described wasn't ancient and untouched. It was land recently emptied of the millions of people who had farmed it, managed it, and built upon it for thousands of years. This is part of why Columbus, and the colonizers who followed, could convince themselves they'd found an empty world. They arrived after the worst of the collapse had already begun. But this isn't only a story about loss. It's a story about continuity. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest still live near Chaco Canyon. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy still governs itself under the Great Law of Peace today. Maya communities across Guatemala and Mexico still speak Mayan languages and follow traditional calendars. Quechua, the language of the Inca, is still spoken by millions of people across the Andes. Before Columbus, the Americas were not empty. They were home to farmers and astronomers, engineers and diplomats, poets and mathematicians. Civilizations that rose, evolved, and in some cases fell, on their own terms, writing their own histories long before anyone else came to write it for them. The story of Native America didn't begin in 1492. It began thousands of years earlier, and it never actually ended.